So we are in the month of February, which means we're still talking about God's control over history. And you went Daniel on us this week.
Still a prophet.
Yeah, well, yeah, still a prophet, but some big heavy reads out of the front end of Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, more narrative, more story than some of the poetic oracles that we've been reading.
Right.
So, and it's more familiar, maybe. I hope.
Yeah, at least 2 and 4, right?
Yeah, in chapter 7, the vision. So yeah, and ultimately, while we're here, is of course, Daniel was one of the great prophets of God's control of history. That's ironically in chapter 4, one of the lessons that God was trying to teach Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar thought, this is Babylon that I have built. And just like we've seen in our earlier readings in Isaiah, where like, for instance, Assyria last week didn't realize that she was really just a tool in God's hand. Babylon didn't realize that either. Only unlike the Assyrians, God gave Babylon Daniel to warn them or make them aware of their actual standing before him. Only Nebuchadnezzar didn't want to listen. And then on the either end of chapter 4, you've got the vision in chapter 2, the vision in chapter 7 of the coming kingdoms, the coming empires that underscore what Daniel was trying to say to Nebuchadnezzar. You're not going to last forever. These other empires in history are coming.
Yeah, as opposed to like talking about Cyrus narrowly. This is that big world picture that in some sense takes us even up to the time of the Messiah.
Well, and that's part of the point, I think, actually, especially, we only, in chapter 2 and chapter 7, the whole emphasis is in the days of that fourth kingdom shall come, a rock or something that's going to, somebody who's going to establish a kingdom without end, because that's what, all men seek in what they build, right? Whether it's, Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, going back to Nebuchadnezzar's, look at this Babylon the Great that I have built. Every great empire builder thinks they're building something that lasts, and God comes along and says, you're not going to last.
Yeah, two problems in that. The last part, which is you're emphasizing, but in the other part of that is, and going back to this theme, they think they're building. Yeah. They think this is about them and their ingenuity and wisdom and brilliance.
Or even what the real project in human history is. It's not about power, and then that's not about wealth, individually or collectively. The real project in history is God's intention to bring a kingdom through a Messiah.
Yeah, so talk about that in chapter 2. Let's start with that.
Okay.
Because that, I think, of the 3 segments you chose for this week, Daniel chapter 2 is the most familiar probably to Bible readers.
Yeah, so that's where, and there's a lot more drama in this, or it's a long chapter, there's a lot more drama in it.
I told you gave us more to read this week.
Yeah, but chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. It's very similar to Joseph and Pharaoh. I mean, and I think there's meant to be a little bit of
some echoes of that.
You have God putting his man in the court of, or at least being available to, the great world leader of a particular era. And so Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. None of his, highly educated Chaldeans can figure out what to do with it.
He is a sharp guy.
Oh, yes.
Because he's not going to let him just come in and give him an interpretation. It's like, you got to know if you know what the true interpretation is, you'll know what the dream is without me telling you.
Yeah, and the drama, because if you can't, then everybody dies. So, I mean, just when you think you've got a hostile work environment.
Actually, it leads up to what I thought was a great parallel between verse 11 and verse 28, because even his magicians respond by saying, hey, what you're asking, nobody knows but God.
Yeah, exactly.
And then he gets 28.
Right on cue.
Daniel says, nobody knows that.
Yeah.
But there is a God who knows that.
I happen to know the God who knows that. So, that's exactly right.
And he's talked to me about that. In fact, when he does get the dream and his reflections on the dream in verse 20, starting there, it's interesting because it plays right to the theme you chose for us this month, particularly 21. It is he who changes times and epochs and removes kings and establishes kings. And that's really is the point of all of this
That's
month,
why we're here reading. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Again, chapter 4 will say that same thing. The Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and gives it to whomever he pleases. And so forth. I mean, that's just how this goes.
Well, I'm anxious to get there, but we do need to say something about the vision.
So the vision itself, yeah, it's an image made of various metals: a head of gold, a chest of silver, legs, thighs
Pretty famous
of
image to Bible
bronze.
students.
Yes, and then the bottom, the legs, the feet of iron. Except the feet themselves are made of iron and clay, and they're emphasizing the brittleness despite the seeming strength of iron.
Inherent weakness.
Well, that's right. And it's interesting that there's a sense in which, the metals, even as you transition, they're all important metals, but in different ways. You go from something that's weaker but more beautiful to something stronger but not nearly as appealing. And so, Rome was certainly known for its fierceness, its, dominating the world. It swallowed up the scope of previous empires, and yet ironically was still brittler than you might have realized, given its seeming strength to those who lived under its dominion, because a Galilean peasant carpenter could ultimately come and smash it.
Well, and so that gets you to 44.
Yeah, that's right.
That famous text that God, in the middle of these kingdoms, is going to set up his kingdom that would never be destroyed.
Right. And that's what people should be seeking for, kings on earth included.
Well, and then you get to, I thought 47 was especially important. Surely your God is a God of gods. Even
right.
even Nebuchadnezzar now recognizes this is
right
the true God.
Right.
However else he was confused about all of that, which is the point.
Right. Well, except that, what he'll do to the very next chapter is build an image all of gold and say, bow down to it.
And then go to 4 because Nebuchadnezzar's such an interesting character all the way through here, right? Because does he get it or does he not get it? Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
He's still a polytheist at heart. I mean, it's going to be the same thing with Cyrus, right? When he technically, in the decrees of return, talks about the God of Israel, but then the truth of the matter is we know from other history and his other things he's left behind, he was still a polytheist. They don't want to hack off this God any more than any of the other gods, and so they'll say the right things, but then they'll still do what they do. Because at the end of the day, too, an idolater and a polytheist at the end thinks they can manipulate the gods to some extent. And that's why I'm going to turn around, build an image all of gold, say everybody bow down to this, and maybe having given a heads up that I might be more vulnerable than I realized, maybe we can, by worshiping an image of gold, and I certainly see who's loyal. I think part of the exercise.
Yeah, that's true. And then you get to 4.
And then you get to 4.
And
it's still all about him.
And God's going to remind him who's in charge.
That's right. You would have thought that whole "you can't burn up the guys who wouldn't bow down" would have been a further wake up call at the end of 3, but no, there is something deep in Nebuchadnezzar in some ways is every man, right? Just that human proclivity to pride, no matter what God does, that we still just want to make it all about us and bring God into our service rather than the other way around.
Sort of the Lance Armstrong of his own day, because that was kind of Armstrong's argument when he won his battle with cancer. You know, don't give God any credit. I did this through my hard work. And you know how that ended for him. Yeah. He really kind of has his own Nebuchadnezzar moment, right? I thought there was a repeated phrase, the first time in 25 and the next time in 32, that was particularly important. This was the lesson. Right. And again, it ties back to God's control over history. Nebuchadnezzar was going to get to live like an animal for a while until you recognize that the Most High is ruler over the realm of mankind and bestows it on whoever he wishes. And then that exact phrase is repeated in verse 32. Right. But that is the point. Right. You need to know who's in charge and who's running the show, and it is you. Right.
And it's funny, that's a great transition, I think, then, David, to chapter 7, where we have a vision whose, in many ways, ultimate point and content is the same as chapter 2. Now you just have 4 beasts that are meant to symbolize these 4 coming kingdoms, from Babylon to Persia to the Greeks to the Romans. And again, same thing in the days of that 4th beast, that 4th metal, there will be a kingdom set up that will never fail, never end. And that's the one you should be looking for, seeking, and hastening. But what's important, and I think worth pointing out in this is, and the hint of the different why you have an image of a man in different metals, and now you have beasts. Part of what was also in chapter 4 is the reason for why that transition, even if the content's the same, the point's the same. And it's this, first of all, in chapter 7, that vision is for Daniel. Daniel is given this vision. In chapter 2, it was given to Nebuchadnezzar for Daniel to interpret. And one of the things that happens in chapter 4, in that same verse you were pointing out to us, verse 25, 7 times will pass over you till you know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men, gives them every will. But it's, you will be made to eat grass like an ox. In other words, you're going to be reduced to a beast, to animal status. And so part of what God is communicating, to Daniel is there's the ground level view of what's going on in history, man's way of looking at history. It's an image of a man with metals that have value and importance to us in different ways. From God's perspective, man without God is actually beasts, and with different levels of violence and dangerous behavior, destructive behavior, down to the point of that fourth empire, just like it was the fiercely strong iron in the image of man. Now it's a terrible beast, almost beyond description. There is no likeness in the animal kingdom for it. But the point is, it's very, very dangerous, and that's how God sees human efforts to build our empires and things. Man wants to see them as some sort of beautiful progress towards, some sort of glorious outcome. In God's eyes, it's just different savage, beastly arrangements that we keep on inflicting upon ourselves. That really, again, don't bring peace and happiness. They bring injustice, death, destruction.
Even as we imagine that it does.
Yeah.
Even as we imagine that getting away from God brings more peace and prosperity. Christianity has often been accused of being the source of violence and genocide in the world, when in reality, exactly the opposite is true, that as men get away from God, you don't have utopia, you have chaos and anarchy.
And more violence, more and more injustice. That's the tragic irony. So the part of the difference there is God wants Daniel to see from his perspective, this isn't a great, ongoing, glorious story of human civilization and its progress. We're getting worse and worse and more like beasts, dangerous beasts, mindless beasts, the further the story goes, until he offers us a different kingdom and a different way to live.
Again, there was a section at the end of chapter 7. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom. This is 27. And all the dominion will serve and obey him. And so we keep coming back to that idea. Maybe that's the thing to emphasize here at the end, that as you're doing the reading this week, these are some familiar stories, maybe 7 not as familiar, but don't miss the overarching message in all of the stories.
Right.
And that is, God is the one that is really running the show. Even in these great empires and these arrogant rulers who imagine they've done great things, you have that dramatic demonstration in chapter 4 of all rulers for all times.
Right.
That God is the one running the show.
Right.
Things happen according to his will. And either we're going to be with him on that or we're going to be on the outside. That's ultimately the question at the end of the day. So something to ponder in a personal way as you do your reading this week.